Good evening, folks, and welcome to this episode of the Seabass Podcast. Today, Monday, December 7th, 2020. This day in history on 1941 is the day when the Japanese secretly and surprisingly attacked Pearl Harbor, a United States naval base in Hawaii. Now, Pearl Harbor Day is significant for obvious reasons. However, for those that either don't know history or don't care to know history, it's the day that the United States officially entered into World War II. The United States policy at the time was for that of pacifism, or not pacifism, but of neutrality. The United States claimed neutrality through the start of World War II until the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Now, Pearl Harbor was the single greatest attack on the United States ever. Nobody had ever managed to reach out and touch us the way, the way that the Japanese had from the Japanese mainland. Now, to their credit, Hawaii is a very long way from the United States, right? However, because it was a state, because it was part of us, it was a huge win for the Japanese to say that they dealt a blow to the United States of America. Now, we all heard in history class the quote from the Japanese uh, general or admiral that said, I'm afraid that we've awakened a sleeping giant. The Japanese really had no clue as to what our resolve was, as to what our true power and capability was. Now, some more history behind Pearl Harbor. So I'm originally from West Virginia. I attended West Virginia University. For those who have attended West Virginia University in Morgantown, West Virginia, for those who have driven through campus there in Morgantown, just above where the B&E building is, the Business and Economics building, and across the street from uh, essentially the history department, uh, is a mast and a bell from the USS West Virginia. Now, the USS West Virginia was a battleship that was stationed in Pearl Harbor. It was lined up like all of the other ships were, like sitting ducks. And the USS West Virginia was sunk. Unfortunately, it was destroyed and it was sunk. However, that battleship was raised, repaired, and refit, and then sent back into service. Now, the West Virginia, what being a battleship, you know, World War II was really the last engagement for battleships as we knew it. And the West Virginia was was a participant in really the last large battleship to battleship engagement of the war. Now, the West Virginia was not only present for the beginning of the war, the West Virginia was present at the end of the war for Japan. When the Japanese officially surrendered to the United States, the West Virginia was present in the Philippines. Now, she ended up, playing a part throughout the rest of the war in, I guess you could call cleanup operations, but she was around. So there's your West Virginia history for you. For those of you who were participants in the Golden Horseshoe exam in West Virginia? Drop a comment. Tell us if that was a question on your Golden Horseshoe exam. Mr. Miller, my 8th grade history teacher, I got a shout out to him. Mr. Miller was a Golden Horseshoe winner in the state of West Virginia for his knowledge of West Virginia history. I was not, I openly admit it, I was not nearly good enough or talented enough or smart enough to go through West Virginia history like some of those kids did. Okay. However, Mr. Miller instilled a love of history in me shortly after my dad died, who originally instilled a love of history in me. My dad was a World War II and Korea veteran. Maybe we'll talk about that story in another episode of the podcast. Mr. Miller, thank you. Thank you for your teaching. I know sometimes it was hard, especially with some of our classes, but you were a good teacher, and I'm grateful to you. And, here it is, 28 years later, 26 years later, that, I remember the Golden Horseshoe exam. Now, because my memory is not that stellar, I did a quick Google search, and the Golden Horseshoe was originally awarded to frontier explorers by the Virginia governor at the time. So folks who went west and did survey work and came back and brought word of the wilderness received a Golden Horseshoe as their prize. So now in West Virginia, the Golden Horseshoe is a pin. It is a program and a test for 8th graders in their history classes to learn West Virginia history. There's a test that's given to all 8th graders that's standardized across the state that they participate in. It is a competition. It is something that you have to prepare for and study for. And yeah, there's some history there about West Virginia and the Golden Horseshoe and some Pearl Harbor history. Moving on. So the United States had been attacked. Now, for those of us who are students of history, for those of us who enjoy history, we all have heard FDR's speech, "A day which will live in infamy," right? We've all heard it. We can quote that line verbatim, right? December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. Okay. We all know that speech. However, the first address that was given after the Pearl Harbor attack was not by FDR, but by his wife, the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, addressed a session of the United Nations, and that was broadcast to the people of the United States. The First Lady of the United States was the very first person to address the people. And part of her remarks, not only that they were more personal remarks than anything else. She talked about her nervousness. She talked about her fear. She talked about her anxiety of a son who was serving in the Navy. She talked about her anxiety for her family that was living in San Francisco. If the Japanese could hit Honolulu, in theory, they could make it to California. And that worried the First Lady. And she expressed her fear, but she also expressed her faith in the leadership of the United States. She went on to say that the leadership, and I'm paraphrasing and kind of going a little bit from memory here, that there was a plan being worked and that a plan was being put in place, and that it would be announced, and that everything was going to be okay. Now, at that time, you know, really, what was the role of the first lady? Almost nothing. Almost nothing. However, she was the very first one to address the people after the bombings at Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. Now, moving on to President Roosevelt. So, President Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress in the House. Again, now for those of us who are students of history and love history, FDR was a cripple. FDR was severely handicapped, and the White House was very hush hush about it. They kept that secret very, very well and kept it very hidden from the American people. At no other point had the United States had an invalid as a president. I'm going to show a video clip and hopefully the audio translates over. I've turned on the closed captions, but hopefully I'll be able to narrate a little bit through the video. FDR needed help walking everywhere he went. Whenever he walked, somebody was at his side, and he did use a cane. In private, though, FDR used a wheelchair. He had a wheelchair everywhere he went. The American public at large didn't know this. This was hidden. This was a secret. And not only did the American people not know it, world leaders didn't know it. And what an advantage we had, because they thought FDR was strong. And FDR knew at that time, especially, that we needed to project strength. Now, as we go through the video, I'll narrate a little bit, and I've already pre-screened it once or twice, I think, just so that I can make a few points in the middle. But as I make those points, make sure that you're watching the video, and then as I point those things out, look at the video, and hopefully it'll help you understand what's going on. So let's turn on the screen share here. Let's go to here. We'll turn that up. Nope. Hang on. Thanks for being patient with me. And we're going to share that. And now we're on to here. Let's make that big. And so this video and audio recording is from C-SPAN. Okay. C-SPAN had this. So here we go. So everybody came back. By all accounts that I could find, all of the members of Congress were present for the president's. Let's pause this for a second. All of the members of Congress were present for the address. Let's come back here. Let's come back. There we are. So here, the second paragraph, President Roosevelt ascended the rostrum on the arm of his son, James, and took his place at the reading clerk's desk, while the vice president and the Speaker of the House presided over the joint session. The president is presented by Mr. Rayburn, who is the Speaker of the House. And hopefully you guys can hear this. So this is the Speaker of the House. There's that classic line. Now, that's his phraseology here is, I don't want to say interesting, but it is very intentional. The United States was suddenly and deliberately attacked. So the Japanese had a really significant disinformation campaign going on. Now I'm sure a simple Google search would tell us how far it is from Tokyo to Honolulu. However, at that time, they didn't have that. They just knew it was far away. Now they had maps. They knew how far away it was, right? The general public knew that it was really far away. Heck yeah, it did. So pay attention to this list. So including Pearl Harbor, seven places in total. And really, back then, there was no such thing as applause lines. Another great line. What a great line. What a great line. So really what he said here is we're going to defend ourselves and then we're coming after you. Notice it looks like he has a standing chair behind him. Another great line. Republican, Democrat, everybody stood for that. Much, much different than today's politics. And this is a newsman on the newsreel. Now, look, the president's being helped off the stage. He has a cane. You can see that he's visibly being helped off. So, what an awesome speech. What a great speech by the president. You know, the United States and its righteous might will win through to absolute victory. What incredible words. What incredible words. You know, presidents throughout time have all had kind of their keystone comments, right? 7 years ago, you know, those kinds of speeches come to mind. This is that speech, you know. In recent memory, George W. Bush, when he had his megaphone in New York City after 9/11, you know, somebody shouted out from the crowd, "We can't hear you," and he says, "I hear you," and pretty soon the whole world will hear you. And that, I mean, that might, of all of George W.'s gaffes and for as much fun as people poked at him, that meant something. That meant something, and people remember that phrase. You know, you think of Obama and his red line with Iran, or not Iran, with oh, who's the other guy? I just had a big brain fart. If you know it, write it in the comments. Obama, red line in the sand. What? Gosh, now I can't remember. That's embarrassing. That's embarrassing. It is. About Assad using chemical weapons on his own people. That's something that people remember. People also remember the non-action after that. You know, with the current president, everybody remembers "Make America Great Again." Now, the current president probably hasn't had a super memorable speech that he's given. I'm not sure that one truly stands out in my mind. However, that phrase does, and that phrase will stick around forever. that will be one of his lasting legacies. So President Roosevelt projected strength. He says, not only are we going to defend ourselves, but we are going to ensure that nothing like this ever happens to us again. Now, if only he could see the future and know and understand jet aircraft and just the way the world would evolve, he might have said something a little different. But for the world for what it was, that was a strong statement by the President of the United States. Now, shortly thereafter, everybody in the United States wanted revenge. Everybody in the United States hated the Japanese. Everybody in the United States hated people of any Asian flavor, especially the Japanese. And a very dark spot and a black eye on our history is our use of, the internment camp, where people who were of Asian descent, of Asian nationality, of Asian appearance were imprisoned simply for those reasons. And that's a real black eye on our history. And American citizens, people who, for all intents and purposes, were not suspicious, they weren't sus, like the cool kids say now, had no reason to be imprisoned, but were. And that's deeply disturbing and pretty sad, and it shouldn't have happened. However, the American people wanted revenge. We wanted a strike. We wanted a way to show the Japanese that we were not powerless. So an Army officer by the name of James Doolittle came up with a plan where we were going to launch B-25 bombers from aircraft carriers in the Pacific to bomb Tokyo. Now, I wish I'd have done a little more homework, and that way I could give you some numbers on the distance. However, there were 25 air crews of 5 men that went out on this and bombed Tokyo. Now, these aircraft did not have, they were essentially stripped down into flying gas cans with no armor to speak of, with no fighter escort. No fighter could have escorted them anyway. There was no way that they would have had the fuel to make it. Even with extended range fuel, I don't know that it would have been feasible or even possible then. But they did know how to strip down these bombers, and we went and we bombed Tokyo. Now, these bombers, through prior arrangements, were able to land, most of them in China, one of them in Russia, after their bombing runs in Tokyo. Now, the crew that landed in Russia was captured and imprisoned. Later, they escaped through Iran and supposedly able to either rejoin the force or retire. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle was eventually promoted to general and became a general of the Air Force. At the time, it was the Army Air Corps, or the Army Air Service, and all the pilots and all of the air assets were Army. So that's how the Air Force came to be, was through World War II. So it's called, that's actually called the Doolittle Raid, or the Doolittle Raiders. So the Doolittle Raid We were able to drop bombs on Tokyo, reach out and touch them, show them that not only yes, the Japanese could come and get us in Hawaii, but we could come and get Japan on the mainland. We weren't hitting outlying islands. This wasn't getting Midway. This wasn't getting Iwo Jima. This was hitting Tokyo. This sent a message directly to the emperor that we're coming for you. History being what it is, the war went on. We eventually dropped the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Japanese surrendered. Now, it's my personal opinion, the use of the nuclear bomb was absolutely necessary, in that had we not used them, we would have committed to sending probably 75% of the remaining force to take Tokyo. The Japanese would have fought to the very last man at the insistence of the emperor. What's interesting is after the surrender of the Japanese, at that point in time, the Japanese regarded the emperor as a deity. He was God, or a god. And after the surrender, the emperor essentially gave up his deity. He surrendered his holiness to the people. And he wasn't nearly as respected. He wasn't held in nearly as high regard. He still was, but his ego certainly took a hit because his divinity was gone. Essentially, his divinity had been erased. So, yes, I believe the nuclear bombs were necessary. Had it not been that way, there would have been mass loss of life on both sides, and even through the devastation of the nuclear bomb, of the atomic bomb, through that devastation and loss of life, it did save millions of other lives. It was warranted and it was necessary. So, on this Pearl Harbor Day, please don't ever forget that this is what drew us into the war. It is what eventually ended up, getting us involved in the war in Europe, where we ended up defeating Hitler as well. So there's a lot of other sub stories. If you have seen Band of Brothers, that explains the war in Europe through the eyes of the men of Easy Company of the 101st Airborne. Really, really good storytelling, really good movie making. And then from the same people that did that, there's a series called The Pacific. Same deal, follows the Marines that ended up fighting all the way to Iwo Jima. So good storytelling, really good history there, accurate history there. So if you enjoy history, World War II is chock full of it. There's lots and lots of references, lots and lots of video and audio to see. I mean, good heavens, the History Channel, World War II in color is amazing. So, folks, our history is important. This will be, let's make this the closing monologue. Our history is important. It's something that we need to honor. It's something that we need to cherish. It's something that we need to remember. It's something that we can't whitewash. Like with the atomic bomb, we used it. We had to. If we were to whitewash or erase that part of our history, there's no, what story is there to tell? What history is there really if we just erase it and make it not there? The same goes for our use of the internment camps. The same goes for statues of General Washington, of General Lee, of Confederate officers. That's our history. We need to acknowledge it. We need to understand it. Hopefully, we don't repeat it. Hopefully, we don't live it again. But these are things that need to be seen and felt and heard and understood. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your viewership. Thank you for your listenership. Please, please, please like, comment, subscribe, share, do all the clicky things. If you feel so compelled, over at anchor.fm, anchor.fm, you can find my show, Seabass Podcast, SEABASS Podcast. There should be a button that says donate or support. Feel free to click that button. You can donate as little as 99 cents. It goes directly to me. It's safe, it's secure. It's a way for you to show me that you appreciate the content I put out and you can help support me. Thank you again. Like, comment, subscribe, share. Hopefully the next episode is going to be just as good.